Good afternoon, everyone. This is Chris Riley with System Source. I'm joined today by Dave Ferg, one of our senior consultants, and we'll be digging into migrating servers and storage to Azure today. Obviously, a huge uptick in work being done on Azure by really kind of across the community of IT professionals that we work with from System Source. And so really kind of as folks look at what's the next thing that I'm going to do with my IT infrastructure? Am I going to stay on-prem for one more round, or am I going to go to cloud? Obviously, today we're going to learn a lot more about what's it take, what are the advantages, what kinds of things go into it, both from a managerial as well as from a technical standpoint for moving servers and/or storage up to Azure. Let's do a little bit of housekeeping here. So first, about the agenda, they will be digging into one is, should you migrate as is or should you build new? Look at some of the Azure services that are under that, really dig into what kind of resiliency, flexibility, manageability would you kind of expect there. And then what about your Active Directory? Always a question that comes up. We'll also be talking about throughout, kind of sprinkle throughout. We'll be talking about security and looking at risk, how to mitigate risk when you move over to Azure, or would you have more risk staying where you are? We'll look at kind of again, throughout, looking at the best practices for migrating to Azure. And we'll also talk a little bit about Azure costs. So one of the things that you'll see in the eval at the end, and I'll talk more about it later, is you can kind of check a button that says, hey, let's talk more about estimating Azure costs. It's very specific to each person's environment, but we're happy to have that conversation with you. So while we won't dig deep into that piece specifically in the webinar today, we can dig deep into that with you individually. And we'll talk more about that later. So that's what we'll be going after with that, and then Q&As at the end. So hopefully you have your pizza by now and that you're enjoying that. However, if you don't have that yet, just make a note of Mike Jones's email address on the screen. If the delivery driver hasn't found your office or your home in the next few minutes, just give him an email. He'll do his best to try to track down that errant pizza for you. A little bit of other housekeeping rather. So the first thing is the audio is in presentation mode. You'll be able to hear myself and Dave, but we can't hear you. But we do that so that any background noise, music on hold, all those types of things that might be occurring where participants may be doesn't come through to the whole group. But you can reach me throughout the session today through either the chat tab or the questions tab. If you drop your questions into the tab as you think about them, then Dave will have an opportunity to answer those for you at the Q&A, which is at the end. I'll read off the questions to Dave, and then we'll take it from there. If there are things that are more involved, more technical, by putting them in writing, also allows us to be able to do that research and get back to you after the fact. This presentation and the recording is going to be sent to you after today's session, so you don't have to write furiously. And finally, I mentioned evaluation, so that'll come to you via email right after the session today. We try to make it a little bit more fun for completing it by offering a $50 gift card or a $50 gift card to your favorite restaurant. You get to pick, and we'll pick a couple of those out of completed evaluations. At the end, I'll let you know what some of the questions that you can kind of request additional information in the evaluation if you wish, or just let us know how you did. So System Source, we've been around since 1981 and on our 43rd year now, thanks to folks like you. So we appreciate that very much. So a lot of folks first come to us when they need to acquire new technology. So while we do in-user computing work, in laptops, printers, desktop computers, those types of things, most of our work is done in the modern data center. So in that modern data center, we're both working for the traditional on-prem as well as the cloud. So today, obviously, we're talking about Azure. We also do work in AWS and all the other places that servers, security, storage can reside, colo centers, our data center, software as a service, all those types of places that your data could live in addition to your on-prem environment. So we're going to be looking at things like servers, storage, security, all of that type of work is going to be happening, whether it's on the on-prem side or in its analogous implementations within one of the cloud environments. And many of the manufacturers, Barracuda, Cisco, and many others have kind of products that work in both. So if you want the on-prem version, they have that. If you want the cloud version that plugs into your cloud of choice, they have that. But we work with organizations like Hewlett Packard Enterprise, Barracuda, Cisco Meraki, the whole Microsoft stack, VMware, and the list kind of goes on from there. But people are acquiring to improve things. So we've talked a little bit about some of the technologies, and Dave and his colleagues in our consulting group helps design, implement solutions based on the kinds of problems that you might present that you want to solve. And then they'll take that all the way through to kind of helping make sure that those are implemented, hand off the keys to you if we're not doing the long-term maintenance on that and management of that. And again, that can be whether it's in cloud or in traditional on-prem. We also kind of help improve things by having our training group with 600 or 700 classes at any one point on our website. It's going to be in all the kinds of technologies I just mentioned, plus about 24 more, and different manufacturers, whether it's manufacturer, kind of specific training or general things like in security. All those types of classes are available through our learning center, and they're all remote as well. In Present, that's our kind of our presentation systems group, professional AV, so all the large monitors and projectors that you would see in conference spaces or in huddle spaces, presentation rooms, auditoriums, executive offices, all the microphones, all the speaker systems that go with that, and all the kind of the custom electronics for for controlling those devices as well as managing those devices. And digital signage. All that happens in our presentation systems group. And finally, we maintain all these things either on a reactive basis. You call us when you need help under service and support. And you can do that whether you have a contract with us or not. Just follow if it's after hours, follow the voicemail prompt 7x24, as well as managed services where we are the IT department for dozens of clients in this region. So that's what a little bit the 75 of us at System Source do. We do have one more upcoming webinar for this month. I think there'll be one more for next month, and then of course things will slow down for the holiday season. Then we'll kick back up with our 40+ events that we typically do in a given year, starting in January. So the next one coming up is kind of for IT management, IT managers, directors, those types of things. If you want to kind of look at a managed service provider, so what are some of the things you might want to consider if that's a route that you want to take? We'll dive into that on the 20th. I'll drop the registration link for that into the chat in case that's something that you want to participate in. And with that, I think, it is time to hand the reins off to Dave. Dave?
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for joining us for the lunch hour. I'm hoping this has some value to you. What we're going to talk about today, as the title suggests, we're going to be talking about migrating to Azure. And that's a huge, huge topic. So we're going to be just kind of sampling some things today, really kind of giving you what I'm hoping it is, why you would want to move to Azure, what some of the benefits might be, whether you're gaining a more flexible environment, whether more security options become available to you, the ability to monitor your security and your performances may be better than what you can do on-prem now. So I'm going to kind of touch on a couple different things, just as some of them as examples. We're not going to drill deep into any one particular thing. We're looking at the big picture right now of what the Azure Cloud Platform can do for you. So what we're talking about primarily today will be this infrastructure as a service world. This is where your servers, routers, things like that would be. We are going to do a little bit of dabbling into the platform as a service is some of the examples we're going to be talking about, but this is where we're looking at today. We're not talking about Office 365. We're talking very little about the Entra ID directory today, but it does play in. So just to kind of set expectations, this is where we're looking today. So when we want to go thinking about bringing in the cloud, we want to migrate. You already have an on-prem infrastructure. Maybe you have a solid infrastructure now and you're moving for a reason such as you want to get them out of an on-premises databases, but you like your infrastructure. We can move that as is, or maybe you're at a state in your on-prem world where you are now thinking about needing to upgrade and modify anyway. those are the times you want to be thinking about this migration. Um, if you're moving from an as-is world, these are probably some of the reasons you were going to, you would be considering this. You want to kind of move fast with minimal disruption, both to the business and to your technical staff. As is means I'm picking up a Windows server, for example, and it's still a Windows server when it's the same Windows server up in the cloud. No more training needs to be done. Your business processes remain the same. The same servers are up there with the same drive mappings, same databases. And it's a way to kind of pick up your on-prem, stick it up in the cloud quickly. Um, it's a strategy you want to consider if your operating system and your applications are current or reasonably current, so you're not needing to deal with upgrades at the same time. Or your current technology, your current design is sufficient for your business. There's no need to make any changes to take advantage of any new features and new capabilities. So the as is would make sense for you there. Now, that being said, the as is may make sense for a piece of your world, and for other pieces of the world, you might want to build new. So this isn't a one or other choice. You want to be thinking build new if your servers and applications are already in need of an upgrade. Now would be the time you could put up a new VM of a new version, put a new version of the application on and move your data. Maybe you want to consolidate service or decentralize services. So you want to have fewer servers in the cloud, or maybe you want to have more servers in the cloud. This is your chance to make adjustments that you may have been stuck with for other reasons in your own environment. So building new now becomes an option here because you're moving to a new data center with new storage capabilities and things like that. Your business needs new technologies. So that's a reason to move up to Azure and start taking care of some of the new things. And for probably most of us, I don't, no show of hands, if you will, maybe you just want to kind of clean up all the fixing you've been doing for years and have a more standardized environment. So maybe you do want to build new and start fresh again. So there's a couple different ways we can go with this. So we're going to talk about first how to move as is. I'm going to give a brief run through of this tool that Microsoft provides for you called Azure Migrate. It is a free tool provided you move within 180 days. Afterwards, they start charging $25 an instance, but hopefully we get the migration done within 100, I think I said 180 days, I'm not sure, but it's 180 days. It's free for then, and that tool will support migrating your servers, databases, web apps, data, things like that. And I'm going to, in my examples here, I'm going to kind of show some of the things it will do with servers. But it's the tool they use to move you as is. So it will let you take advantage of moving you up to Azure's high availability and security without modifying your on-premises servers, if you will. They're going to be the same thing when they get up in the cloud. The Azure Migrate tool does a couple things for you, though, that's actually quite beneficial in the migration process. The first of all that does is it discovers what it is you have in your environment, so you can choose what it is you want to migrate. And we'll also then give you a business review, so saying, here's what it would cost you up in Azure to move what you're selecting to move. So now you can do our ROI analysis as to whether this will be beneficial for you or not. Now, a word about ROI when you're moving to the cloud. Yes, there's real hard dollar cost you have to concern with, but there's also the soft dollar approaches, just the fact that you're going to be gaining more flexibility, greater DR capabilities, more fault tolerance and replication and things like that may have a value to you that's worth the extra cost if it ends up costing more to move to the cloud. There's no guarantee that moving to the cloud becomes cheaper, but it definitely can become more robust than most people's data centers. The tool then, after discovering, will replicate your data and get all the VMs staged for cutover into the world, and then will allow you to migrate. Now, when we do that, when you're building that, you have a couple things you can do along the way prior to the cutover that are very beneficial. One of them is to do a test migration. When you're configuring an Azure Migrate migration, you define what the production subnets would be for these VMs when they go into production, but you can also define a separate set of testing virtual networks and subnets up in Azure that are isolated so that prior to the cutover, we can do a test. So all the machines will fail over into this test subnet. We can then log into them, make sure they're coming up okay, make sure they're communicating with each other okay, and now our confidence for cutover is significantly higher because we've seen it work without disrupting the production network. The testing of the migration is all offline and it's done behind the scenes because it's going to a network that is isolated. Now, caveat on that is if your applications are up in the cloud, when we move the VM to the test subnets, it won't have access to the cloud. So we're going to have to make some kind of adjustment as to what we're going to be testing at that point. But at least it lets you know that the machines will come up and come up cleanly so that when you're ready to migrate, you have confidence. And when you actually do the live cutover, all it has to do is do a final synchronization and then build the VMs into the production networks that you've defined and then let them come up live. And it will bring down your on-prem VMs for you. So the as is migration using the Azure Migrate can be done quickly. The cutover time is reasonably short. And I say it that way as we do have to sit through a final synchronization. So you're going to ask for some downtime, but it will not be significant. The actual cutover, once the final synchronization is done, is really quick and the machine will be up in the new environment. At that point, if everything's accessed through a DNS name, then you'll probably be pretty good right away. If you still access things through an IP address, there'll be some adjustments, but hopefully in our pre-planning, we've kind of planned all of that ahead of time and are ready for it. So when we go to build new, for either your entire environment or for a piece of environment, this is just a very similar to a traditional refresh project where you're just going to be building new servers, new applications, and making a move for it. So as you would in an on-prem refresh, you build new Windows servers, you install your apps, you move your data. This then gives you the opportunity to right-size your VMs, to consolidate, to decentralize, whatever it is you want to deal with at that time. But it is also the time now where you have the opportunity to take advantage of some of the new Azure things that are available. Not everything needs to run on a VM. Azure offers some services that are replacements to having applications run on servers. And for the next few slides, I'm going to walk you through 3 of these as an example: Azure Files, Azure SQL, and the Azure Web Apps as examples of things you could implement in place of having the traditional Windows virtual machine with an application running on it. So this would be your opportunity to take advantage of some of these newer features. So let's talk about Azure Files as our first example of a new technology we could take advantage of moving up to Azure. Azure Files is a storage account up in your Azure that supports file shares, SMB, HTTP access to your file shares. Just like you have a file server now with shares, this is just shares. You don't have a server to manage, you just have shares to manage. And users make access to those shares. Now, they can make an access directly to the cloud, but if you're finding that is not a high enough performance to you, this service also enables you to put an on-premise server for caching purposes, for synchronization, so that your users can connect to an on-prem device that has cached the data, but it's being synchronized with your cloud. So your data lives in the cloud, being cached local for the users to have access to. So we would have to determine whether that would be sufficient for you without a caching server, and if not, we would put a caching server in. But now what I've done with this service, at least in the cloud side of it, is I've eliminated my file server VM, and I'm putting everything just in Azure storage. Now that also has some other advantages to that. that we'll get to in a minute as far as fault tolerance and replication. These file shares can be accessed using your Active Directory accounts or Entra Domain Services accounts, or you can use a traditional storage key. Every Azure storage account has a key that you can just put in and make an access through this key. But you can also access it through your domain accounts, your Active Directory. And we're going to speak a little bit more about this a little later. This is a managed Active Directory that's up in the cloud that is synchronized from your Entra ID that would let you gain access. So you can still have your permissions based off of user accounts and just like you do today on that. So that's how it gains access to things. Permissions, they support all the Windows ACLs so that you can use a robocopy to move your files. So it's easy to get you up there. High availability. This is one of the reasons you might want to consider using Azure Files over having a VM being a file server. And we're going to talk about this redundancy a little more a little later, but just briefly, your storage account has 3 copies of it in a data center. So when you build a storage account and you put data up there, there's automatically 3 copies in your data center. But we can also then replicate that to another location so that your file shares can be living in 6 locations for your access. So the availability now becomes very high that they're, for your data at that point. So that's just one of the advantages of using this, is because of the background storage replication for that. So again, you eliminate a file server, you put in Azure File Shares as an option. When you're creating this, this is that redundancy, the performance, all that is built right. I'm creating a storage account. My primary service I'm defining as Azure Files, so it's going to be setting it up to support file shares. I can pick the performance I want for it, whether I want standard disks or premium disks. I can pick what kinds of redundancies I want for it. And then once that storage has been deployed, I can start creating shares and moving my data up there, and then users gain access to the share either directly or through a caching server. So that's one of the options you have as you move to an Azure environment, eliminating traditional Windows file servers and just using Azure storage that supports shares. SQL is another thing that they offer as a service. One of your options is to run a Windows VM with SQL Server on it, as you do today. That is always an option for you. But you can also deploy Azure SQL Database. Now, Azure SQL Database is a service. It has compute up underneath of it, but you don't manage the compute portion. You just access the database. There's going to be 3 ways we can talk about how this can be deployed. This first one is SQL Database, and there's a slide coming soon that will help clarify this a little bit here, which is just a relational database as a service. It deploys as a single database managed through a logical SQL server. So you will be able to pick how much compute you want sitting up underneath of it, but you don't actually manage that particular server. You've just defined the compute that will service this one database. So you do have control over how much compute gets into it. Your responsibility is to manage the database. Microsoft manages the compute portions for you. So you're not having to upgrade your SQL, upgrade your Windows, patch that, anything like that. You can also deploy, if you have multiple databases that you want to deploy, you can deploy that into an elastic pool where your compute are multiple logical machines. Again, you pick the compute power, but there'll be multiples underneath of them that can ramp up performance as needed for a particular database, or scale it down as needed for a particular, if you're in your low volume use. So your compute goes up and down as your demand goes up and down on that. You can also deploy an Azure SQL managed service, which means you're not going to have a choice of what compute you put up underneath of that. You're just getting a SQL database instance to manage. It's probably the most common method because it's quickly being able to put a database up there. But as with all the others, you're managing SQL. You're not managing SQL Server or Windows Server. So you're just using the service to get the database that your business needs. And here's that diagram I was mentioning about. So you have three options if you wanted to go down this path here. There's the SQL database, which could be a single. You define the compute that will sit up underneath of it, and you have that much compute always for that particular database. So if you have a stringent requirement to know how much compute you have to performance, this may be an option for you. If you have multiple databases, not just one, you might want to consider Elastic Pool, where again, you pick your compute. That would be the VM model is how they would present it to you, and how many of these you want in your pool. And then it efficiently load balances your databases based on demand, expanding to the pool and pulling down from the pool as needed. Or you just get an instance of a database that you can work with. So advantages of going down this path is the storage and compute redundancies that are built in behind the scenes. So even when you have that single compute resource of the Azure database, it's built in a fault-tolerant world under the hood to you. So the access is already in a high availability gateway of configuration. So when you go to make that connection to the port, you're hitting something that's already built in fault tolerance for you. Your compute that's sitting up underneath of that is already sent across multiple racks and servers and databases underneath the hood. So even though you've asked for a single compute power, under the hood, the machine that was originally running you could go down and another one would just come up. You would be unawares of that, and it would just keep running for you. So in the standard or general purpose tier, you get the high availability front end, and you get this redundancy for fail over on the under the hood. On the premium tier, under the hood is an always on availability group. So if you're moving from a SQL server that you have on premises, a Windows box with SQL on it, and you go up to the cloud, you're automatically getting the high availability built in for you. That's just the advantage of that. And you're losing the need to having to manage the SQL server itself and dealing with patches and Windows patches and all that other stuff. You just manage your databases. So no server manages, it uses Management Studio to gain access. And of course, Microsoft is going to keep that up to date for you. So a third example is web apps. So if you have IIS in your environment, a web farm, if you will, that's traditionally a IIS server with an app installed on it, okay, just like we have on-prem now. Similar to with the SQL, where we're going to separate compute from the front-end application, web apps separates the app hosting from the compute that sits up underneath of it. When you're configuring it, you configure something called an app service plan. And that app service plan is defining how much compute you want sitting underneath of there. Think of the Elastic Pool in SQL. It could be multiple servers sitting up underneath of there, load balancing your website. All you need to manage is the app and the webs and the web interfaces from there. So you don't have the management capability on the server management to worry about. You only have app management to worry about. But you can get maybe even more compute power than you have on-prem by building an app plan that has a lot of services underneath of it. So when you go to deploy this, you can deploy this web interface to be code-based, container-based, Linux-based, Windows-based, what programming stack you want to have run on it, what region you want to have on it. There's also going to be some replications that you can configure for there under like zone redundancy, how zone redundant, and I'll clarify that term a little later in the presentation. The pricing plan is that web app service plan where you pick the compute that you want to sit up underneath of it. And part of that plan is not only what the compute power of each logical machine is, but you'll define how many of those you want, running up underneath the hood for you. You can enable continuous deployment, so you can hook it in with your deployment software. You can have that enabled and pull those things from Git, so all of that stuff can be automated for continuous deployment of that. So that's already built for you. That's probably a phrase you want to keep in mind when you're thinking about moving to the cloud. A lot of these things are already built for you that you can now just configure into your environment. You don't have to deploy services that will do, like we'll talk about later, logging services or clusters or any of that. It's already there for you to utilize and just enable. If your web app needs access to an on-prem database, an on-prem SQL database, web apps support that through something called a relay hybrid connection. Think of this as a queue, and there's an agent that we put on-prem. Doesn't have to be on your SQL server directly. It just has to be on a server that can access your SQL server. And between that agent talking to the queue and the app service plan talking to the queue, we can have your web app reach back down on-prem to talk to your SQL database. So maybe your migration plan is to move the web first, and someday later you'll move to SQL. You don't have to move these things together. We can make them reach across. So Azure Files, SQL database, Azure Web Apps, those are just examples of things you can do when you go to Azure to replace a server with a service. And in this bigger picture, this is a picture here of the web app service being deployed. Where this could envision sitting behind here is you have your web apps and you can put a gateway service up in front of that, a layer 7 gateway service. We'll talk about that in a little bit here. Your web app service can have their credentials stored in a key vault, so you don't have to have it in code or written in scripts. All your secrets, passwords, certificates, all of that stuff for security within your app can be stored within a key vault up in Azure. It can be stored on a SQL database up in Azure or on premises. Your DevOps stuff can be configured to link straight into it, so it's in a continuous deployment. And all of this can be configured so it doesn't have any public access. So everything can be configured through things called private endpoints or service endpoints, so that your security is that your stuff only talks on your subnet and has no internet access to it. Just in case you're not aware, Azure resources are accessed over a public IP address, but we can eliminate that and keep everything on private IP addresses into your subnet, which is connected through a site-to-site VPN, but potentially through your on-prem world. So this is all internal to you. So we have that level of security, interfaced with a gateway, interfaced with load balancers, with our security defaults in here. A lot of this stuff in this slide here was talked about in a previous webinar we had done in early October. And in your eval, there's a checkbox if you wanted to talk about security. If you check that, we'll send you the link to that webinar that talks about some of these features that you can build in for security in your environment. So why do I want to move to Azure? Probably, in my opinion, one of the biggest reasons is the fact that you're moving to a global network that is built for resiliency. Most data centers do not approach the resiliency that Microsoft has built into theirs that you can now take advantage of. There are 60 plus regions and 300 plus data centers all connected with each other. And you get to tap into that and utilize the replication that's already been configured within that, so that you can have multiple copies of your data located in multiple locations around the world if you needed it to be. And here's where we're going to start explaining some of that replication stuff I had mentioned earlier. So regions, so like the East-West region, are actually a set of data centers. So when I talk about a region, we're talking about an area that has 3 separate data centers, all on their own power, all on their own grids, all on their own everything, so they're independent of each other. These data centers are called zones. So we can have services that run in one zone, And then there are something called zone redundant services, for instance, Azure SQL, that runs across all 3 zones, so that if Microsoft loses an entire data center, your services are still running. Nothing you need to deal with. That service is zonal, zone redundant, and will automatically be available to you. Services like a virtual machine that are locked to a data center because it's a virtual machine with a network card can be configured for multiple zones, but you have to configure that. You have to check the boxes to say, I want multiple copies of these. And as you have multiple copies, yes, you do pay a little more for it because you have multiple copies, but now you have redundancy built in. So some services are that way automatically. Others you have to manually configure if you want them across multiple zones. For example, I'm creating a virtual machine, and when I want to configure its availability options, I can either say no, or this is a pull down window that's kind of cut off here. If I say availability zone, I get to select, if I wanted to be manually configuring it, what zone or zones I want this virtual machine to be in. Now, if I pick multiple zones and I have data on my VM, I'm going to need to be making sure how much understanding the replication and things like that to keep that in sync. So I have a little more play to deal with that, but I do have that option. So let's say, for instance, I have an IIS server that I want to have available across multiple zones. So I want a Windows-based IIS server. I can put a copy of each one in the 3 different zones, which, if you remember, is 3 different data centers here. And then I can put a load balancer up in front of that. So there's one ingress point here where I hit the load balancer, and then it can talk to servers across zones. So now if a data center goes down, I still have something else processing. So that's what I get just for going up into Azure. I have these capabilities. Regions are paired, so that the East US region is paired with the West US region. Some things are automatically replicated across those regions for you. Others can be configured to replicate across those regions, so that if you lose an entire region, which is multiple data centers in an entire region, you can have your stuff in another region. And so that if you used a service like the Azure Traffic Manager, for instance, we'll talk about that one a little bit later. If one entire region goes down for Azure World, you can bring your world up in another region, and you're working again. All of this is pre-built for us. We just need to implement the services that do these things. We don't have to build the nuts and bolts to make it work. So we have redundancy within a data center. You have redundancy across data centers and across regions if we want it. So these load balancers I was talking about, some of the redundancies that you can add to your world. In that one picture I had with a lot of that security information, it showed an application gateway, which is a layer 7 gateway that can manage, offloading images to different pools of servers. We also have the traffic manager, which is that DNS. I'd showed you that in the previous slide. But you also have a standard layer 4 load balancer capable for you. So if you want to build a server farm and have it load balanced, you have that capability as well. So, but not only for the front end, but for the back end pools, and you can have all kinds of configurations. So these load balancers are there for you to deploy through the click of a button, and then the configuration so that you have redundancy in your environment. One of the biggest reasons to go to Azure, in my personal opinion, is redundancy. The second will be security, which we'll be talking about shortly. Briefly, because they had that previous seminar that drove a little deeper. But these are the 2 things that I found in most of my clients that we can do better in Azure than we could on-prem. So let's talk about that storage redundancy so you have an idea of what that looks like. Any storage account that you open up, whether it's a managed disk, whether it's a blob storage, whatever it is, you're going to get 3 copies of your data locally within the same data center. So from rack to rack to rack. So you have 3 copies of that. So if a server fails in the data center, you're still good. If an entire rack fails in a data center, you're still good. Where you're not good is if a data center goes down. That's called locally redundant storage, but you do have 3 copies of that. We can go to zone redundant storage, where those 3 copies are now 1 in each of the data centers within a region. So now I can fail, Microsoft can lose 2 data centers in a region, and I still have my data. Right? Now you pay a little extra for that because there's traffic going across, and they factor that into the cost. But now you've protected yourself against a Microsoft data center failure. All right. We can then go to geo-redundant. So my one data center with local redundant storage or zone redundant storage can be geo-replicated to another data center and have copies out there. So again, you pay a little bit more, but the infrastructure to do that is built in, and it's a checkbox to enable or not enable that feature. And this is what will make Azure Files strong. This is what will make SQL services strong, these kinds of replications and multiple copies of things that you get just by having these services up there. So as I mentioned, redundancy is one of the great reasons why you'd want to go to Azure. The other is security, because we can now start configuring very granular security to your resources. So you can have administrators configured using their, the same login they use for, for any administration, but you can configure an administrator to only have access over a piece of your network, and another administrator has access over a bigger piece or a smaller piece. So now we can become very granular as to what resources my administrators can gain access to and to what they can do with those, whether they can only read the resources or can they modify the resources. Maybe they're able to modify a VM but not shut it down or power it up or add a new. We have that kind of granularity to what we want to do, and that is, from my experience, superior to what most people have on-prem now. They have administrators that, once they have that level of access, have that level of access across the board for like all VMs or all storage and whatnot. But now we can get very granular and grant people administration maybe to just one VM if that's what we wanted, without having to create a separate account for them to do that. All right. So in this example here, it's showing a resource group and shows that we can grant a particular user login different levels of access. Maybe can just read the resources, can contribute, which means I can manage and make changes and maybe reboot if it's a VM, et cetera. Or I'm an owner, and means I can grant other accesses to it, et cetera. So I can become very granular as to who have what level of access to any particular resources, and then that can get inherited down the tree, if you will. These permissions can be role function based or privileged based. So administrative based, or maybe I can just manage a particular job function role within that. So I have that kind of granularity. You can start to see some of them showing up down here now. That kind of granularity to the role. So it doesn't necessarily have to be administrative only. It could be for job function based on that. You can always verify what the permissions are, not only from looking at the list of who has what, but you can check your access or check someone else's access. That's, when you go to check access, I want to know what this user can do with this resource, and it will tell you. So you can double check yourself to make sure people have enough. In that security webinar that I'm referencing that we did back in October, there are also things called access reviews, so that people can verify the access periodically, administrators or business managers, et cetera, so that we can make sure that the people that have access to it should still have access to something. So again, I would go back and take a look at that one again. So roles and permissions can be then scoped, like as I was mentioning, that become very granular. We can manage, we can handle them all the way up from the management group level of Azure to the subscription group level to resource group level, all the way down to the individual resource itself. That's the scope in which I'm going to be granted permissions to do things. So my role assignment is based off of not only who I am, but what roles I've been given and the scope in which I've been given that role. That's what I can do with any particular resource. So I can become very, very granular with that, which is a feature that I tend to not see in most people's on-prem environments. Monitoring. So one of the things that we can do with Azure, and you can do on-prem, but you have to, again, set it up, is in Azure, we can monitor things easily now because of log analytics and Azure Monitor services that are available to us. Log analytics is our resources, our servers, our store logs into the analytics workspace. So each table in this workspace is one device's logs. And now that we have access to all of the logs in one place, we can start either using built-in queries or our own custom queries, start taking a look at what's happening in our environment. Now there's an insights and some dashboards that are already built for you, but we can build our own dashboards through using the KQL query language. And from there, build alerts to that. So we can be monitoring our logs for particular things, using query language. And if we see something, generate alerts from that. So we can build this monitoring capability, either something we can go in and look at or something that alerts us. So we can build insights dashboards, which again, some of these are already built for you already, with certain values that are already there, but we can go into the data since we have all the log information, since we have all the tables, we can go ahead and do our queries and build our own dashboards of what it is we want to see by looking at insights or the metrics of how things are performing, etc. Again, we can run our own, pre-canned queries. So these are right here, or we can just kind of get that up out of the way and run our KQL queries. So these tables, which we would find in the log analytics, are being sent by devices into the log. We can be querying these tables for any data that we want in any format we want and develop the report that we want so we can get the information we want. So all of this is available to us. Configuring something to send to log analytics gives you some insight into some things, but if you want a more detailed, customized control of your world, this is available to us to enable and build these queries, save these queries, run these queries regularly so that we have this information happening in our environment. Who's accessing what? How much data is moving out in and out of my network here? What two servers are talking to each other, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can just kind of find all of that out and know what's going on in our world. And from that, we build our own custom dashboard so we can monitor that. One of the things that that always scares everybody is we don't know what we don't know. So how is that with my security? How is that with my performance? How is that with my costs? Well, there's an Azure advisor that will tell you these things. Now, again, another advantage of just moving up to Azure. It will tell you how your cost is going and some recommendations that you might want to consider for implementation to improve your costs or improve your security or improve your reliability. And as you drill into any one of those, there are the recommendations. You can click on that. It will tell you how to go turn that on, what's the ramifications of turning that on, et cetera, or whether you don't want it, you can just say, please just ignore that. I know that's your recommendation. I can't use it, et cetera, and you can turn that off and it doesn't show up here anymore. If you're familiar with the Office 365 Secure Score, this is the Secure Score. So the Azure Advisor tells you maybe some of the things that you don't know about your environment and kind of says, hey, there's a new security standard you might want to consider. Here it is. Click on it and see if that's something for your environment. So it kind of gives you a proactive look into your world to following best practices on that. So one of the questions we always get in any migration is, what about my Active Directory? How do my users authenticate to Azure resources? Can I get rid of my Active Directory? So one way you can do that, and the most common way I see people make at least their first step into Azure, is you extend your AD up into Azure by building a site-to-site VPN between your subnets on-prem and the Azure subnets, and then you put a domain controller up in the cloud. And now all you've done really is build a new subnet in your environment and you have your Active Directory presence up there. You can install VMs up there, servers, etc., and they're Windows servers on your domain as it is today. No functional change whatsoever in your environment. That's easy enough to do. You can migrate to resources that support Entra ID authentication. Now, Office 365 is a common choice. File migrations, we always get the question, can I move to Azure? I mean, to systems, to SharePoint for my file servers. I'm going to sidebar here real quick and say yes and no. If your data shares have very simple security, meaning whoever has access to the share has access all the way down the share. If your file structure is not too deep, and if your files are not a bunch of databases and other highly chattable things that have to deal with temp files, you have a possibility of moving your data into SharePoint. And then once in the SharePoint, it's your Entra ID credentials that authenticate to it, etc. Most people's file shares are not like that, and it takes a lot of work to get them like that. Where I've seen success in that, and I'm still on my sidebar here, where I've seen success in that is you've moved some of your data up there. Your user home directories you've decided to put into OneDrive. Maybe your archive files that are not complicated in their structure you can put into SharePoint. But yeah, and then other files you've kept in your day-to-day file shares, which could be end up becoming Azure files, etc. So, but that uses Entra ID. Using Entra ID to access other IaaS services up there gets a little tricky, but it can be done. A third option is to implement the Entra ID domain services. Now, this is kind of your first step of moving out of Azure completely, but this is an Active Directory. It is managed. You don't have access to the domain controllers. You just have access to the directory. And then it can be applied to any Azure server up in Azure. It does not support your workstations joining it. So you have a managed domain that you can put up there, and the authentication can happen from there. To see this graphically, your first option is this: site-to-site VPN, your domain controller on-prem, your domain controller in the cloud, so that's your Active Directory. If you want to start using Entra ID credentials, you can synchronize that over to Entra ID. If you have Office 365, most of you probably are very well aware of this. Now the same credentials that are our Active Directory credentials can access the Office 365 and the SaaS services that are up here. We can also use this to single sign on to other third-party apps, etc. We've talked about that in other webinars as well. The domain services that Entra offers, again, is an Active Directory. It receives its accounts from Entra ID. So you end up with an account in your AD, a separate account in Entra ID, which happens to match user ID and password, and a separate ID over in domain services, which happens to match user ID and password. But here's where we can put our Azure resources from here. So this is where the authentication would be taking place. The user would think it's the same account. Under the hood, it's a different account. So this is what the things you can do. And this is a simplified picture. There's yet other things we can do. We can have Office 365 refer to your AD for authentication, etc. So there's a lot of other things we can do. But that's what we would do with authentication. And of course, between Windows servers that we've put over here and servers that we would put over here, we can build a trust between them so that we have access to resources that are sitting in both of these worlds, and users have less change in how they're accessing resources. So in summary, I think I'm good on time here. When you're migrating your VMs, you can migrate them as is, which is a fairly quick, low risk move because it's the same thing you have now. We're just placing it someplace else. Or we can build new and start taking advantages of new services, new solutions. And I mentioned 3 of them: Azure Files, SQL, and Web Apps. that you can start getting rid of servers and be starting to replace with services. Now, one of the things about moving to services that I didn't say back then is that is things we can start introducing the Entra ID login as the authentication path instead of the Active Directory account. One of the reasons you might want to move to Azure is because it's probably more fault tolerant than what you have now and can be replicated globally if you wanted it to. It's replicated in the data center, it's replicated across data centers, and can be replicated across regions. Security can be applied at very granular levels across many layers. So now I can have administrators of very specific things instead of having an administrative account across all things. Logging is there for you to use. You just need to point devices to a log analytics workspace or to an Azure Monitor log analytics workspace. And then you can either use the built-in queries that are already there and just click and run and see what Microsoft is going to provide you, or build your own that can not only give you information and generate your reports, but can alert you if necessary. And of course, the I don't know what I don't know can be addressed through the Azure Advisor. Think of that very much like the secure score that Office 365 would give you. It's the same idea. It will tell you, here's some recommendations for costs. Here's some recommendations for reliability. Here's some recommendations for security. And you can pick and choose what it is you want to turn on and turn off. And it gives you all the how-to and ramifications of, etc. So that's what that would be the reasons I would suggest you be considering a move to Azure, because we gain all of this availability and security going on there. The best practices that can be given to you by Azure Monitor, the reducing of security risks by using the remote, the role-based access control that's available to you, et cetera, et cetera. So that is my spiel for today. I hope it was some value to you. And Chris, I'm going to hand it back to you to say our goodbyes. Or not. Chris, are you there? I guess he's not.
Sorry, I'm right here. It was apparently muted in two different places. So thank you very much, Dave, for that. We don't have any questions for the Q&A, so let me go ahead and wrap up with a couple things here. We did put some courses together here with some discounts that are associated with Azure, so those are on the screen there and will be in the packet when you receive it this afternoon. The discounts are for those who are on the webinar and for this month. I also mentioned for the eval that you'll get, one is we try to make it a little bit more fun with the $50 giveaways. We'll pull a couple of the completed ones, but we talked a little bit earlier about some of the things that are some of the options for additional information that are in the eval. One is for Azure Security. We can send you the presentation, the recording, as well as the PDF for a prior webinar that we've done that just dug down on Azure Security, as well as a separate webinar that we did that just dug down into Azure Backup and DR. So we can send you those resources as well. Obviously, you can talk about training. We can also get with you and kind of talk about Azure sizing and cost estimations, since that's always very specific to your environment. And then finally, there's on there kind of a migration, an Azure migration planning and whiteboard session with Dave or one of his colleagues to kind of talk about what do you have and what would kind of be a plan, a high-level plan look like to get you there, kind of whiteboarding that so that you can kind of decide, is this kind of something you want to move forward on, those kinds of things. So some of the options there, or you can let us know what specifically would be helpful to you. So with that, we want to say thank you for everybody for coming out today. Hope the information was good. And again, thanks to Dave. Have a great afternoon, everyone.